comet splits the night sky above the forbidden city. Below, a court astrologer drops to his knees. He knows what this means. The mandate of heaven is breaking. Somewhere in the mountains, a fox spirit laughs as a warlord's army gathers. Change is coming, and even the gods feel it. What if your fantasy world worked like this? Welcome to Just-in-Time World Building, and the first episode in my new series, World Building for Genres and Cultures. Today, we're drawing inspiration from the vast and mystical traditions of Chinese mythology to help you build a fantasy world where magic, empire, and immortals are part of everyday life. So, just a caveat before we get started, I am not an expert. If I say a thing and an expert says a thing about China's history and so on, the chances are I'm wrong, the expert is right. Also, this series is about fantasy world building, not historical accuracy. So bear all of that in mind with everything that I say. Okay, let's dive into a brief history of China. If you're building a fantasy world inspired by Chinese mythology and history, you need to start with a big picture. And China's historical scope is very big. Chinese civilization stretches back over 3,000 years, with its earliest known dynasty, the Shang, confirmed through archaeological records. Before that is the Zhai dynasty, considered semi-mythical but culturally significant, especially in how later dynasties linked themselves to the Zhai to claim legitimacy. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Anyway. Over the centuries, dynasties rose and fell according to the mandate of heaven, the idea that emperors ruled with divine approval, but that heaven could revoke that mandate if the emperor became corrupt, unjust, or unable to maintain cosmic and earthly harmony. Signs like natural disasters, rebellions, or celestial omens signaled that a ruler had lost heaven's favor. We'll talk more about mandate in the later politics section, so, hang tight for that. What's important to understand here is that this concept isn't just political, it's cosmological. In your fantasy world, this could mean gods literally withdrawing their blessings, storms overwhelming cities, or rivers rebelling because the rightful flow of qi has been disrupted. China was home to an astonishing array of early innovations. Bronze weaponry as early as 1600 BCE, the crossbow invented in the Warring States period, which was the 5th century BCE, which allowed conscripts to fire with lethal force. Standardized writing and weights under the shin. The compass, paper, printing, gunpowder, and advanced metallurgy, well before similar developments in Europe. A complex bureaucracy based on merit through the imperial examination system, long before Western civil service structure took hold. Cities were even laid out according to cosmic and geomantic principles, aligned with the poles, cardinal directions, and qi flow, which makes for a perfect excuse to add magical feng shui systems to your world. But the high watermark of innovation came under the Song dynasty from 960 to 1279 CE. If you're building a fantasy empire at its cultural and technological peak based on China, this is the model. The Song oversaw a period of staggering advancement. Movable type printing, paper money, canal networks, coal-based iron production, accurate astronomy, arguably the world's first market-driven economy. Cities like Kaifeng and Hangzhou boasted populations over millions of people. It was a time of philosophers, poets, engineers, and bureaucrats, a golden age of urbanization, science, and economic dynamism. But the song had a critical weakness. They were administratively strong, but militarily cautious. To prevent internal warlordism, they intentionally weakened their generals. And that ended badly. First, the Gersons invaded from the north, capturing half the empire and forcing the court to retreat south. The southern Song continued to innovate and trade, but they were constantly under threat, and eventually the Mongols came along and finished the job, and by the way also conquered the Gersons, so, there went that. And the Mongols founded the Huan dynasty and subjected China to pretty much decades of warfare and foreign domination. This collapse of the Song Empire had very long shadows in the Chinese culture. The trauma of the Mongol period made later rulers, especially under the Ming dynasty, deeply suspicious of military decentralization and foreign entanglements. So while the Ming inherited the capability for global influence, they lacked the incentive and the trust to use it. And that's where we need to talk about Admiral Zheng He. In the early 15th century, Zheng He led massive treasure fleets across the Indian Ocean, sailing as far as East Africa. These ships were larger and more advanced than anything in Europe at the time. They built monuments and dazzled the world with Chinese power. But here's the catch. These voyages weren't about exploration in the Columbus-type sense. They were about power projection, a way to show off the restored Ming dynasty after a century of Mongol rule. Think of this like Theodore Roosevelt's Great White Fleet in the 1900s. It's not a search for new land, it's a geopolitical flex. And when the emperor who supported Zhang He died, the Confucian bureaucrats, who had always resented the cost of those voyages, shut it all down. The records were lost, the shipyards were dismantled, and China turned its attention inward. Why? Because they didn't see the point. As the Middle Kingdom, China saw itself as the cultural center of the world. From that perspective, everyone else should come to them anyway. Merchants had low social status, and there was no capitalist class pushing for expansion. And Confucian officials prioritized agriculture, harmony, and defense, especially along the vulnerable northern frontier. And that's why China never set out to conquer the world. There's also a deeper economic reason for that inward turn, as historian Ian Morris points out in Why the West Rules for Now. China didn't need much from the outside world. They already had silk, porcelain, tea, gunpowder, compasses, and printing. Europe, on the other hand, desperately wanted what China had. That hunger created the incentive to explore, to colonize, to trade dangerously, and in Columbus's case, to accidentally discover the Americas. So in the end, China didn't conquer the world not because it couldn't, but because it didn't see the point. When budgets tightened, prestige missions like Zheng He's were the first to go. And that's the foundation we need for fantasy world building. An empire with a long memory, world-shaping inventions, and a worldview that sees itself as the center of the world, even as the environment around it might change. Okay, so that's a very abbreviated history of China up to the Renaissance-ish kind of period. Next, let's turn to the culture, mythology, and philosophy that gave this empire its soul. Because if the history explains how China looked inward, the culture explains why it saw itself as the Middle Kingdom. And that worldview is what makes a Chinese fantasy world so unique. Chinese mythology isn't just storytelling, it's a worldview. The universe is structured into 3 layers: heaven, earth, and the underworld, all connected by the flows of qi, the vital energy that animates reality. Presiding over this cosmos is a celestial bureaucracy, a divine mirror of the imperial court. At the top sits the Jade Emperor, surrounded by river gods, mountain gods, wind spirits, door gods, and even a kitchen gods, who reports your family's moral behavior to heaven once a year. In this worldview, everything is structured. Everything has a role. Creation stories reflect this structure. In one myth, the giant Pangu cracks open the cosmic egg, separating heaven from earth with his body. In another, the goddess Nuwa shapes the first humans from yellow clay and repairs the sky with 5 colored stones. Legendary cultural heroes like Shenong and Fuxi teach humanity how to plant crops, heal sickness, and write characters and fish. Myth isn't distant here, it's practical. It explains why the world works the way it does and what your role in it should be. In your fantasy world, that means myth isn't the bedtime story, it's part of the system. When a river floods, it's not just geology, it's politics, it's cosmology. It might mean the river dragon is angry or that the emperor has lost the mandate of heaven. And if your emperor's power flows from the heavens, the natural disasters aren't just tragic happenstance. They're signs that reality itself is rejecting the ruler. Alongside mythology, Chinese civilization was shaped by 3 philosophical traditions that wove together over time: Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. Confucianism focuses on social order, hierarchy, family duty, respect for elders, and loyalty to the ruler. It sees society as a web of obligations, with the emperor at the top as the son of heaven. Taoism, by contrast, emphasizes harmony with nature, the balance of yin and yang, and the pursuit of inner alignment with the Tao, the natural way of the universe. Taoist sages often retreat into mountains, seeking immortality or spiritual power through alchemy, meditation, or subtle manipulation of cosmic energy. Buddhism, arriving from India, introduced ideas like reincarnation, karma, and salvation through compassion and discipline. Over time, these 3 worldviews blended together. A government official might quote Confucius in court, practice Taoist exercises at home, and fund a Buddhist temple to gain merit in the next life. For your fantasy world, this means that religion isn't exclusive. It's overlapping. People don't belong to one sect, they draw from all of them as needed. And while religion influenced everything from morality to architecture, China never developed a centralized theocracy like medieval Europe. Worship was often personal, ancestral, or localized. It was deeply respected, but not institutionally dominant. This integrated mindset also extended into the arts. In Chinese culture, art wasn't just decoration. It was a form of philosophy, expression, and even law. Calligraphy was considered the highest art form, where the shape and flow of each brushstroke revealed the moral character of the writer. Ink paintings, often done on scrolls or silk, emphasized landscapes, mountains, and mists. Scenes meant not to imitate nature exactly, but to capture its essence. Porcelain and ceramics became famous for their beauty and technical excellence. Blue and white porcelain and jade green celadon were prized around the world. I did a whole video about pottery, which you can check out in the information card. This artistic sensibility opens up amazing possibilities in fantasy world building. Imagine a spell system where the way a character writes a glyph, not just what it says, but how it's written, the angle of the brushstroke, affects the outcome of the spell. Or think of a sacred garden that literally challenges chi, creating zones of harmony or magical restoration. In a world where beauty and balance are part of how the cosmos functions, art becomes a form of magical infrastructure. In the world of China, colors too carried enormous weight, not just culturally, but legally and spiritually. Yellow was reserved for the emperor and symbolized the center of the universe. Wearing yellow without imperial permission could be punishable by death. Red represented joy and luck and prosperity. It was used in weddings, festivals, and protective charms. White was associated with mourning and death. Black symbolized water and the north. It could imply mystery or concealment. Green and blue stood for vitality and youth. Gold and jade were associated with purity, immortality, and divine authority. So in your fantasy setting, color isn't just fashion. It's law, it's symbolism. A court sorcerer might only wear blue when performing water rites. A rebel might wear yellow to mock the emperor. A merchant wearing white to a formal audience could be taken as a subtle insult or a spiritual protest. And I did ages ago do a short video on colors in world building, which you can check out in the info card. If you'd like me to do a longer video on colors, let me know in the comments. Anyway, clothing in general in China was tightly regulated through sumptuary laws, rules about who could wear what. The emperor alone could wear robes with the 5 clawed dragons and the 12 imperial symbols like the sun, moon, mountains, fire, and constellation. Princes and nobles were restricted to 4 clawed dragons. Bureaucrats wore robes embroidered with rank badges or buzi, squares showing animals like cranes, lions, or tigers that signaled their position in the civil hierarchy. Commoners were limited to simpler fabrics and muted colors. This gives you so much fuel for fantasy drama. A peasant wearing silk in secret because you believe it's lucky, risking execution for superstition. A usurper donning the 5-clawed dragon robe to declare illegitimate power. A tailor crafting magical clothing that alters status, breaking not just law but the cosmic order. In a world where even your clothes are a statement of alignment with heaven, fashion becomes a battlefield. I also did a video on sumptuary laws, which you can, check out in the information card. Hey, I've got a big back catalogue. Go watch it. Anyway, so culturally, this was a civilization where myth, philosophy, and aesthetics weren't optional. They were the structure of life itself. The gods walked alongside your ancestors. The colors you wore had legal meaning. The garden you walked through was aligned with the stars. In a Chinese-inspired fantasy world, you can't treat magic, art, and law as separate boxes. They're all part of the same system. Power isn't about armies or politics alone. It's about harmony with the universe, visible through robes, poetry, ink, and ritual. And that's what makes Chinese world building so rich, or world building inspired by China, I should say, so rich. It's not just the visual trappings, it's a whole world view where politics, cosmology, and aesthetics reinforce each other. If you want to create a setting that truly feels Chinese inspired, then let your characters live in a world where style is law Ritual is reality, and heaven watches every move. Next, we'll turn to economics, how trade, farming, and wealth worked, and how, in a world full of dragons and immortals, even money might carry spiritual weight. When it comes to economics, you have to understand this. If Chinese culture gave the empire its soul, economics gave it muscle. It was the engine that kept people fed, armies moving, and cities thriving. At the foundation of it all was agriculture. Ancient China's economy rested first and foremost on farming, rice in the south and wheat and millet in the north. And if agriculture was the foundation, then water was the lifeblood. Massive state-run engineering projects like the Grand Canal and elaborate dike systems weren't just public works. They were arteries of the empire. These projects made it possible to ship surplus grain from the fertile south up to the northern capitals, where soldiers, officials, and urban populations needed to be fed. If you controlled the grain, you controlled the empire. And controlling the flow of water meant controlling transportation, and therefore also the flow of information and the processing power of the bureaucracy. People underestimate all the time how important logistics is. In war and in peace, in politics and in art, no matter what you do, logistics, the movement of stuff, people, and data is key to literally everything you do. If you remember nothing else about my videos, always think about how stuff moves from one place to another when you're world building. It is the most important thing you can decide. Anyway, back to the economy. Beyond farming, trade networks made China wealthy and culturally center. Overland routes like the Silk Road carried silk, jade, and porcelain westward, while bringing back horses, glass, and musical instruments and spices. Meanwhile, sea routes linked China to Southeast Asia, India, the Middle East, and even East Africa. These networks didn't just carry goods, they moved ideas, technology, and sometimes religion around. But make no mistake, this wasn't free trade. This wasn't laissez-faire capitalism. Trade was regulated, taxed, and carefully managed by the state. Certain ports were restricted. Some goods could only be sold to government buyers. In some periods, private overseas trade was even completely banned, resulting in a lot of piracy, obviously. I mean, come now, humans are humans. That kind of controlled economy makes for great world building. Imagine caravans carrying not just silk but enchanted talismans, or merchants who have to bribe the river gods to protect their boats during monsoon season. Or, maybe you have a rogue smuggler who is sneaking forbidden magical scrolls out of the empire. Or a border town magistrate is both taxing trade and extorting merchants for magical artifacts under the table. The possibilities are endless when trade isn't just commerce, it's also a central part of the politics of the state. Inside the empire, Chinese society had guild-like organizations, especially in the later dynasties, that oversaw specific crafts like silk weaving, porcelain making, or jade carving. These guilds regulated standards and passed down techniques, but unlike merchant republics like Venice, they operated again under the authority of the state. Autonomy was very limited. The emperor might honor a master artisan, but that honor could vanish overnight if the court changed its mind. Currency within China shifted over time. For centuries, bronze coins with square holes were strung together in cords and used across the empire as coins. In some regions, bolts of silk or bricks of tea acted as a de facto currency. Then came one of China's most remarkable economic innovations, the first paper money in world history, issued under the Song dynasty. Man, I'm telling you, the Song are so underrated. They came this close to an industrial revolution. Anyway, but no matter the form of currency, whether you have coins or paper or silk, it was always underwritten by imperial authority. Listen, the state is central in China. It's always central. So, if the authority of the state wavered, so did the value of its currency. When dynasties lost the mandate of heaven, their coins and paper often became worthless overnight. And that's an important reminder for a fantasy world. Gold glitters, sure enough, but if the gods no longer back your ruler, all the gold in the world might not buy you so much as a bag of rice. Now, did Chinese officials talk about balance in economics and harmony? Of course they did. But often more as a political philosophy than a financial policy. Confucian scholars idealized the farmer as the moral backbone of society, grounded, humble, productive, while casting merchants as greedy and parasitic. Official rhetoric emphasized harmony, moderation, and frugality. But behind the scenes, economics is economics. It's about power. Feed the people, pay the troops, keep the trade routes open, and you stay in charge, no matter if there's an earthquake or two. Fail to do that, and either the peasants are going to revolt or the river dragons will stop your barges from getting through, probably with a little help from said peasants. So when you're designing your fantasy empire, remember that economic control isn't just background flavor. It's a source of magical, spiritual, and political authority. A good harvest might mean your emperor is favored by heaven. A failed one could be grounds for rebellion, especially if the emperor didn't have a surplus of grain to feed the people with. In short, the Chinese economy was pretty deeply practical, tightly political, and almost always tied to centralized control. And that brings us to the next topic. Politics, in a world where the emperor claims both heaven's blessing and earth's bureaucracy. In a Chinese mythology-inspired setting, politics isn't just human. It's divine. The emperor doesn't rule by bloodline alone, but through the mandate of heaven. A metaphysical endorsement that signals heaven's approval of his rule. And that mandate can absolutely be revoked, as we said earlier. Famine, rebellion, earthquakes, floods. These aren't just disasters, they're warnings. If things are going wrong in the empire and the emperor is not prepared and cannot help his people, then the ruler has lost heaven's favor and rebellions will start. If those rebellions succeed, he's definitely lost heaven's favor. The emperor is supposed to maintain balance between heaven and earth. If he fails, the cosmos itself starts falling apart, hence the whole mandate of heaven concept. But here's the thing. A ruler with divine backing often can't act all that much, because if they actually do something, they might stop seeming divine. Too much hands-on work looks human. And if they seem too human, well, that might cost them the very mystique that gives them power. On paper, the emperor was the Son of Heaven, the supreme authority over all under heaven. His word was law. In practice, it was more complicated. The emperor had to rely on the bureaucracy to implement his policy, and bureaucrats could slow walk, reinterpret, or quietly ignore anything they didn't like. He also had to navigate court politics, balancing rival factions like the Confucian scholar officials and the palace eunuchs. Some emperors were energetic reformers, micromanaging state affairs. Others were ceremonial figureheads, with ministers doing most of the actual ruling. And in many cases, the people working under the emperor were perfectly capable of outmaneuvering or circumventing his will entirely. In your world, this opens up rich storytelling potential. Imagine a ruler who is cosmically powerful, the literal chosen of the gods. But politically kind of weak. Maybe they bear a divine aura or wield spiritual power, but it's still the court ministers, generals, or magical advisors who truly run the empire. You get tension between image and influence, between celestial legitimacy and bureaucratic reality. Okay, so let's talk about the engine that actually kept the empire running: the bureaucracy. The real machinery of the state wasn't the throne, it was the desk. Imperial officials were selected through the civil service examination system, which tested applicants on their mastery of Confucian philosophy, poetry, and classical literature. These exams were famously brutal, sometimes requiring decades of study, but they offered, at least in theory, a pathway for social mobility. A peasant's son who passed the exams could become a magistrate or even a minister. In practice, of course, access to tutors, books, and time heavily favored the elite over the peasants, obviously, but the idea mattered. Moral cultivation and intellectual rigor, not just noble birth, could make someone fit to govern. And that was one of the reasons why China blossomed under the Song dynasty. Bureaucrats managed nearly everything in the empire: tax collection, grain distribution, local law, criminal cases, infrastructure. They had more day-to-day influence on people's lives than the emperor ever would. The bureaucracy was also strictly hierarchical. Every official had a title, a rank, and yes, that clothing code, with their robes displaying their position down to the embroidered animals on their chest. It was also where I gained the inspiration for my noble sashes from my own world in Sangwheel Chronicles, my epic fantasy series. Brief organic plug there for that, where I use sashes that designate the noble houses of my various nobles. Little side note. Anyway, while bureaucrats ran the empire, someone else ran the palace. And that's where the eunuchs come in. And they were some of the most feared and powerful figures in imperial politics. Because they had no family ties, emperors often trusted eunuchs with sensitive roles. Over time, they gained immense influence, controlling access to the emperor, running the palace intelligence networks, and sometimes even commanding armies. At their peak, they were kingmakers, and sometimes shadow rulers. This created an ongoing tug-of-war between two power blocks: Confucian scholar officials, the bureaucrats, who accused eunuchs of corruption and decadence, and eunuchs who were often closer to the emperor and more loyal to the throne than to the bureaucracy. That tension makes for a great storytelling device and a real drama generator. Your eunuchs could make excellent analogues for some kind of magical advisors, people cut off from normal life, trained within secretive palace systems, and allowed access to divine power that others can't touch. Maybe only they can speak with celestial messengers. Maybe only they can perform rites on behalf of the throne. They become a built-in mystery class, feared, necessary, and never quite trusted. Last thing to consider in politics: if you're coming at creating a Chinese-inspired culture from a Western perspective, there is one big political difference between Europe and China to bear in mind. China was usually a unified empire. There was the warring states period and all that, but usually a unified empire. Europe, on the other hand, was mostly a fragmented patchwork of warring states. In Europe, those constant rivalries fueled arms races, siege warfare, and eventually colonization of overseas territories. In China, a centralized government ruled over a massive territory, with imperial control reaching down to the village level. Taxes, law, and grain moved through a system designed to manage an entire civilization. The military was mostly focused on defending vast frontiers, especially from steppe nomads in the north, not on conquering rival kingdoms or launching long-distance wars. And you can see this clearly when you look at the history of gunpowder. China invented gunpowder and, under the Song dynasty, the fire lance. But gunpowder was not as relevant in China because they didn't have the concept of siege warfare in the same way that it existed in Europe. China had massive armies, and fire lances honestly weren't much better than crossbows at taking out a peasant. But Europe had the constant threat of sieges and inter-kingdom warfare, so when the gunpowder arrived in Europe, it developed into cannons, and cannons ended siege warfare in Europe, among other things, but it was also the starting point of gun development. So, if you're writing a Chinese-inspired setting, keep that in mind. A unified empire has different innovation pressures than a fragmented continent. You'll see more advances in medicine, infrastructure, paper, finance, and civil administration, and much less in weapons tech or long-distance naval warfare. And that shift might change how magic evolves too. If your fantasy world mirrors China's structure, then most conflicts won't be about toppling rival lords. They'll be about defending the realm against external threats or maintaining harmony within it. That means that your magic system might be focused on border defense, weather control, cavalry mobility, or spiritual alignment. If you want a world of magical arms races where everyone's inventing the next wall-breaking spell, you're probably better off taking inspiration from Europe's medieval patchwork or Japan's warring states era, because Japan sat somewhere between China's stability and Europe's chaos, culturally unified under a divine emperor, but politically divided among competing warlords. That tension, one heaven, many swords, creates a completely different flavor of fantasy, one where loyalty and ambition constantly clash under a shared cosmic order, rather than the harmony of the Chinese state. So to recap, a Chinese-style fantasy empire, political power is layered. The emperor is sacred, but maybe weak. The bureaucracy is everywhere, slow but stable. Eunuchs are strange and powerful and dangerous. And heaven is watching, ready to pull the plug if balance is lost. Next, and our last section in this very long video, is how politics, philosophy, and aesthetics interact with the supernatural. One of the wonderful things about drawing from Chinese mythology for world building is that you don't need to invent a magic system from scratch. The myths already hand you one, fully developed, symbolically rich, and tied directly to philosophy. Magic in this world isn't chaos, it's structure, it's law, it's the way heaven and earth communicate. Immortals are central to that system. In Taoist mythology, they aren't gods in the Western sense of the word, but perfected humans, sages who've transcended mortality through discipline, enlightenment, or sheer stubbornness. They retreat into the mountains, refining qi, brewing elixirs, and meditating until they dissolve the boundaries between flesh and spirit. Sometimes they bless virtuous mortals, but just as often they test them, setting impossible riddles, disguising themselves as beggars, or offering lessons through mischief. They're not moral paragons, they're mirrors of the Tao, unpredictable, elusive, and beyond the reach of human categories. In your world, an immortal might be both a mentor and antagonist, a being who forces growth through disruption. Dragons too play a very different role here than their Western cousins. Forget the treasure-hoarding monsters that are the adversaries of your heroes. In Chinese mythology, dragons are administrators, celestial civil servants of nature. River dragons regulate floods and rainfall. Sea dragons control tides and storms. Mountain dragons shape the veins of the earth, channeling qi through the landscape. The emperor's authority was often symbolized by a dragon, showing his alignment with heaven's mandate. When the rivers flooded or the rains failed, it wasn't just weather. It was a failure of governance, both human and divine. In your world, dragons don't have to guard treasure. They are treasure. They hold the stability of nature itself together through the divine bureaucracy. Then there are fox spirits, the Huli Ying. They are among the most flexible and fascinating beings in Chinese folklore. Sometimes they appear as beautiful women, sometimes as mischievous tricksters, and sometimes as sages in disguise. A fox spirit might seduce a mortal for love, or trick them to teach a lesson, or ruin their reputation, just to prove a point about their arrogance. Their morality is very fluid, and they represent the liminal, that uneasy space between spiritual and human, the natural and the civilized. A world that includes them is a world that acknowledges grey areas in its spirituality. Death, too, in the Chinese mythology refuses to be cleanly separated from life. In Chinese cosmology, the dead remain part of the household. Ancestors must be fed. Ancestors must be honored, fed, remembered. If you neglect them, they will grow restless. Hungry ghosts wander the world when the proper rites aren't performed, spreading famine, misfortune, or disease. Some corpses can even reanimate through qi imbalance, becoming the infamous Jiganshi, hopping vampires who drain life energy from the living. They restrained not with garlic or crosses, but with ritual spells written on yellow paper talismans, plastered to their foreheads to hold the spirit in place. The boundary between the living and the dead is a bureaucratic one, and if the paperwork of the afterlife fails, the ghosts start filing complaints. All of this ties back to how Chinese-inspired magic works. It's not raw chaotic energy, it's ritualized structure and symbolic. Taoist sorcery depends on talismans, charms, and hand gestures, and carefully spoken invocations. Feng Shui or geomancy isn't superstition, it's magical civil engineering. A palace built on the wrong dragon lines can literally collapse from spiritual imbalance. Magic is about harmony, balancing yin and yang, invoking the 5 elements, channeling qi through the correct pathways. A failed spell doesn't just fizzle and die. It can warp weather, sour the crops, or offend a local deity. Every act of magic has moral and cosmic consequences, because everything is connected under heaven. That approach opens up a lot of creative space for fantasy world building. You can have a ministry of magic that's organized like the bureaucracy with exams, and they can hold ranks and civil titles and submit their spell work for review. Casting without a license could be beyond illegal, it could be blasphemous. Or you could have magical duels fought not with fireballs but with poetry. You could have 2 scholars composing verses in real time, each line twisting the flow of qi to counter the other's rhythm until one's harmony collapses and the spell backfires. You can even build a whole story around qi imbalance, a drought that isn't just caused by climate, but by a corrupt official whose moral decay has disrupted heaven's flow. Fix the politics and the rain returns. In a world like this, even history becomes magic. Heroes don't just die and leave stories behind. They ascend. They join the celestial bureaucracy as minor gods or immortal administrators, influencing the living world in subtle ways. The line between myth and reality isn't a line at all. It's more like a gradient. And that is what makes Chinese-inspired fantasy so fascinating. When magic is everywhere, nothing is ordinary. Not the weather, not a poem, not the placement of a gate or a bowl of rice. Every action, every word, every symbol participates in the maintenance of the universe. In a world like that, politics, economy, and spirituality all combine to reflect the same truth, that balance is the highest form of power. In a world like that, celestial laws matter as much as earthly ones. Dragons rule rivers, and spiritual and political intertwine. In the next episode of World Building for Genres and Cultures, we'll explore sword and sandal world building. So make sure you're subscribed and hit the bell to catch that. And if you made it all the way here in this video, drop a fox face in the comments. A huge thank you to all of you for watching, and a special thank you to my channel members who make videos like this possible and gain some really cool perks like early access to my videos and downloading worksheets from my site. And a very special thanks to the just-in-timers of the Stone tier: Tony Lamanna, Katie Kofimug, Epic, Necromancer JM, A. Wallyard, Neil Buckley, and Laura Bones 79, along with the wood and straw tier. Your help allows me to keep making these videos, and I am very grateful. If you would like to support the channel right now, one free way to do that is simply to watch another video. And if you like this video, you'll probably like my video on how to set up mythological layering, which you can check out right now on screen. Or you can follow whatever the algorithm is recommending to you. And I will see you soon for another episode of Just in Time World Building.